Okay, we're here again with another Igor Vasiliev app, which is always an adventure. This is a thing called Classic FX. Now right off the bat it looks very like Fieldscaper if you have that, but it's a very different kind of application. In fact, this is not a scaper at all. This doesn't make any noise. This is an effect application. It's running at the moment using inter-app audio hosted inside of AUM. It does run as an AU3, which a lot of people will be pleased about, so you can run more than one of them. The only reason I've got it running as IAA is you get a true full screen, so it's just nicer for demo, but functionally pretty much identical as far as I can tell. So we need to say a little bit about what this application is. It's kind of paradoxical. It looks very futuristic, kind of Star Trek user interface here, but it's actually designed to mimic some very old-fashioned effects, and these are things like flanges, phasers, wah, auto-wah, rotary speakers, chorus effects, and so on. Now I had thought when I first looked at this app that it was going to be something like a kind of a sanitized or packaged up version of Fieldscaper that would kind of like a Fieldscaper player, if you like. It's absolutely not that. It's worth saying a little bit about the architecture of this because it is kind of confusing. Once again, Igor is putting the competition to shame. He has a help page underneath this question mark at the top right here. If you click on that, you can read about this. One thing I noticed about this is it doesn't remember where you are if you go out and come back in, which is different to the Scaper apps. Now that's not too much of a handicap because the next thing you'll notice about this help, if you scroll all the way through, it's not very long. Now that's a bit of a clue that this app isn't perhaps as complicated as you might imagine on first sight. Nevertheless, under the hood, it's worth saying that these effects are built up from, the usual kind of very low-level things that we're familiar with, so delays, low-pass, high-pass filters, LFOs, and so on. But we don't have any direct access to any of that. Next layer up, constructed out of those basic building blocks, are what Igor terms modules. Now the modules are things like auto-wah, chorus, flanger, phaser, and so on. Now again, we don't have direct access to those modules in the sense that we can take them and combine them in our own ways. What we have to rely on is the next level up. Igor has defined a bunch of what he calls algorithms, and the algorithms are collections of those modules. So you might get something that combines an effect with a rotary speaker and a chorus, and so they're packaged up in an algorithm that's given a name like, I don't know, Star Trek. But the important thing is those modules expose controls that we can tinker with, and we do that tinkering through this rather strange user interface. Right, okay, so this idea of the algorithm is key. So when you see things on here, if you look towards the top of the screen, we've got to the left, I'll use my mouse, we've got a word that says atmosphere, and if we click on that we can choose a bunch of things. Now these are actually presets, but largely speaking the preset names are the same as the algorithm names. The difference is a preset is the algorithm, which is the particular combination of modules, plus the settings that we choose to tweak on the screen. Then we can save all that as a preset, and we can save that as a custom preset. So the basic building blocks are modules, algorithms, presets. So at a high level what we're seeing here is two circular control panels which are essentially duplicates of each other. So we can have two different effects running independently or in parallel or in combination. We'll look at that in a second. Below that there's a sort of strip along the bottom where these effects are labelled A and B. And if you look at the extreme bottom left, we've got a button labelled A, which currently has a red flash against it. There's a one to the bottom right, which is labelled B. If we click on that, we've selected B. Now all this is doing is switching between essentially hearing the leftmost or the rightmost effect. If we click A again, you can see that both of those red flashes are extinguished, and what we have now notionally is a mix of A and B, and this orange slider comes into play. If the slider's all the way to the left, we're hearing 100% preset, we'll call it preset A. If it's all the way to the right, we're hearing 100% of preset B. If it's set somewhere in between, we're hearing a mixture of them. Might be worth trying to just demonstrate that. Now I've got a bunch of audio things loaded so we can experiment with those. I've got a piano set up, which is a nice clean sound, helps us get a sense of, you know, what's going on without too much muddying up of the effects. I've got some straightforward vocal stuff going. That's just got streamer running in the background. Got a couple of looped audio samples, got some guitar. I just turned off the effect for a second. Got some vocal. We can try those, but we'll stick with the piano for now. So you can, you know, you get a sense right away. There's an effect there called atmosphere, and it does what it says on the tin, gives you this kind of atmospheric reverb kind of effect. We'll look at how to tweak that in a minute. If I switch to, so that's letting us hear preset A. We've got a different one loaded on preset B, which is called flanger orbit, which has got some sort of flanging going on, so you can hear there's a difference there. Now if I move that slider so there's a combination, oh sorry, I'm going to turn off the B, so neither A nor B are selected. So now the slider works. So 100% A, that's a mixture. I'll move that slider. Well, you can hear that something's happening. If I choose to click this button that's labelled cycle, you can see it's rapidly cycling between A and B. Now, is that cycling between 100% A and 100% B? I'm not quite sure if that slider has any effect if the cycle is on. But if I play, well, you can hear that something's going on there. We can control the rate of cycling with this triangular slider above that. You can see that affects the rate. I can't remember if that's in seconds. That looks like 6 seconds for the whole cycle, or maybe that's in beats, I can't remember. That cycle might be better if I choose let's choose the guitar sample. If we make that cycle slower, choose the other sample. Daddy was an aviator. He really loved his aeroplane. He did not believe. So that's what the cycle does. For now we're going to turn that off and we'll just select preset A. So most of what I'm going to do in this demo is I'm going to focus on the leftmost radial control panel and just take it as read that the rightmost one is identical, and you can switch between them. I mentioned having a clean sound to try out these effects as being quite important, and if you read the help file it does suggest that working on mono input streams is better than working on stereo input streams, although it will work perfectly well with stereo. And the reason for that is a lot of the effects rely on playing with the stereo field. So if you've already got stereo effects on the upstream side, you know, you might think you'll get richer output effects, and that's, you know, can't argue with that, but one man's richness is another man's chaos. So simple or ideally mono audio streams. There is an option in the app settings to use the left input channel only. So if you've got a stereo stream and you do find it's not working too well, you can choose just to use the left input channel. So I found that in tinkering with these things, you know, something simple like a piano is good. Or again, I've got something going, some voice input from Streamer.
what Liberia has gone through during the last 3 decades. This includes the worst ever outbreaks of Ebola in 2014 and 2015.
What you do notice there is that even switching directly between the A and B presets by pressing the A or B button, that switch over is affected by the rate, or I think that's called rate slider. So we get a slow switch over depending on where we set that slider. Let's have a look at the user interface then. Broadly speaking, we've got, well, let's just start with this area over here on the right hand side of the leftmost radial control panel. So we've got a number of things. These two triangles are sliders. The first one that we look at is the innermost one. This is essentially an attenuator for the output. If I just play a chord and drag that slider, you can hear that output is reducing. That's just if you want to finesse the level of the output. Next out from there is basically a mixture of the dry wet signal. That's familiar with from many other audio apps. So we've got a 50-50 mix more or less there. If we go all the way to the bottom, it's totally unprocessed. We're not hearing the effect at all the way to the other end. We're hearing 100%. Let's try the flanger one. 100%. It's hard to grab that with the mouse for some reason. Unprocessed, and then somewhere in between. So back over to preset A. So that's what those two sliders do. The next slider out is a different style of slider for some reason. Now, this is unlabeled. I have said to Igor that it would be nice if that was labelled. It's the only unlabelled thing that I can see on the screen, and it means it's kind of difficult to stumble across what that does. But this slider here, now what you should see is as I drag it, it's showing at the top of the screen that it's changing the algorithm that we're using. Now you might wonder what's the difference between changing the algorithm here and changing it in the slot at the top left of the screen or the top right of the screen. And indeed, when we drag that, you'll notice that that slot at the top of the screen doesn't change. Now what's happening here is again, this is just a slight confusion, I think, in the way this is set up. We're changing the algorithm here, but the label we're seeing at the top of the screen is not the algorithm name, it's the preset name, which just happens to be the same as the algorithm name. And the difference is when we drag this slider to change the algorithm, it doesn't affect the settings on the control dials that we might have changed. I hope that makes sense. If you experiment with that, you should get a sense of what that's doing. So that should allow us to actually, we set up our sliders as we want them, then we should be able to scroll through those algorithms and hear a difference. Let me use this guitar sample. Actually, before I do that, if I set the dry wet mix to completely wet, it should be unmistakable. If I drag through those slowly, well, you should get a sense that that's doing something to change the quality of the output. Let me just go and reload that preset so it undoes any changes I've made. Okay, so that's what those sliders do at the right hand side. So let's look at the other sliders. We've got a group of sliders up towards the top left here and a group of sliders towards the bottom left. These control three different things: a thing called echo, a thing called modulation, and a thing called effect. Now these are the three clusters of controls that the modules expose for tweaking. I have to say that the distinction between modulation and effect is kind of lost on me. Essentially, these can be hardwired into, depending on which algorithm we choose, one or other of the modules or some combination of the modules, and it allows us to tweak them in real time. Now Igor has said, and it says in the help file, that broadly speaking these things are unified across all the, I never know whether to say algorithm or preset. I'll say algorithm. Now what that means is, although they may do different things specifically under the hood, broadly speaking they have similar kind of effects. So if you kind of know that modulation, you know, seems to have a huge impact on the quality of the output sound in one particular algorithm, you should find that when you load any other algorithm, it has, broadly speaking, a similar sort of effect on the output. That's most obvious for echo. I mean, echo is pretty close to being exactly a delay effect. We've got, if we look at the bottom left here, we've got the level, and then we've got a feedback and a rate. Let's just try that out actually. Does this one have echo? So we've got an echo there. If we change the feedback to be smaller, we only get a couple of echoes and then it dies away. If we change it to be longer, we get more. We've changed the rate. And again, actually what you'll notice there is when we change the rate slider, we get something that's very characteristic of a delay effect, which is you get that sort of speed up, slow down as it resyncs with the rate. Something else that's quite familiar, if we set the feedback to maximum and the rate to maximum, we get almost a ring modulation effect. So that echo will pretty much work in a similar way across all of the different algorithms. Now moving up to the top left of the display, we've got the modulation and effect sliders. The only way to find out, incidentally, what the modulation sliders, the effect sliders, and indeed the echo sliders control is there is no way to discover that just by looking at what you see on the screen. You have to go into the help file and scroll down to the bottom where it lists presets. Well, it says it lists algorithms. Let's see, the one we're looking at is called atmosphere. So in the atmosphere algorithm, this is constructed from a vibrato module and an echo module, basically. So this is quite a simple algorithm, and it shows that the modulation rate and depth sliders control the vibrato, whereas the effect sliders control, mixing of the echo and vibrato. Let's see if we can. So modulation controls vibrato. Let's check that out. If we go modulation depth, you can hear that vibrato. It's varying the pitch subtly. If we change the rate, that's getting faster. Incidentally, a couple of things to say about these sliders. The first thing to say is that slider, this is a beta version, so this may have been fixed by the time you see this. That slider I think is labelled, I'm pretty sure Igor has agreed that's labelled back to front, so the label seems to suggest that as you go clockwise the modulation rate gets slower, actually it gets faster. But also the other thing to say about that is the operation of these sliders is inconsistent in the direction. So let's say the echo sliders that we looked at consistently increase the level or the feedback or the rate as we go clockwise and decreases as we go anti-clockwise. That isn't uniform with the modulation and effect level sliders, I think. So if we go to the modulation depth, the depth increases as we go anti-clockwise. And the other thing is that the graduation is on those sliders as well. Now some of them seem to get further apart as you go in the direction that increases the value, and conversely they get closer together as you decrease the value, but that's not uniform either. So that's all up for grabs. That may have changed. So pretty much we've covered those things. Let's choose a different let's choose a preset called Dimension D, and again this is because it's if we look up in the help, this is just a slightly easier one to demonstrate. So Dimension D uses the chorus, vibrato and echo modules in combination. Modulation, rate and depth control the vibrato. Let's look at that first. Modulation, rate. So that's similar to the one we just looked at, but actually it's more obvious. Depth. And what does the see, you have to scroll that down again. And the effect level controls the intensity of the chorus effect. So if we go effect level, dial it right down. There's minimal chorusing, we dial it up. Let's put the dry wet to fully wet. Let's turn the vibrato down. So you can hear that chorus effect is increasing. If I just play one note, it's clearer. So that's the modulation and the effects slider. Again, if we just scroll down some of the algorithms and see flange orbit, we've got modulation controls, rotary horn, rate. Not sure what a rotary horn is. I think it's some sort of physical speaker that spins on a motor or something like that. And then the effect level controls the intensity of the flanging. So let's try that one out. So if we change the modulation rate, that was the rotary horn rate. That's quite nice. I like that. And the effect level controlled flanging, something to do with the flanging. Well, anyway, that's what those sliders do. So that's three. Those are the directly tweakable sliders. We've got three other things on this radial user interface. We've got three wedge-like artifacts. One of these, the simplest of these, is labelled width, and this is about this controlling the stereo. You just drag this thing in and out, the stereo field width. So let's see if we can hear that on here. What you should notice there is that as we drag that slider out, we're getting a sense of, I guess that flanging uses the stereo field as part of its effect, and we're just widening that with the slider. Okay, so the next wedge we're going to look at is this one at the bottom right. This is labelled follow, and this is an envelope follower. This relies on, or it tracks the amplitude or the volume of the input audio signal, and depending on that value it varies a parameter in one or more of the modules making up this particular algorithm. Now again, we can't choose which of those parameters it varies, and the only way we can discover that is if we go into the help. If we look at the one for flanger orbit, flange orbit, the envelope follower affects modulation rate and modulation depth. Now we're going recursive here, so modulation rate and depth control the rotary horn's rate, and then the envelope follower controls the modulation depth. So it actually says that it controls the rate and the depth. So let's try that out. So what you'll see is, actually now I've drawn your attention to it, if you look at that wedge, you get a graphical depiction of that input volume. So if we play softly, you can see that pulsation doesn't come out very far. If I hit harder, velocity sensitive keyboard obviously, it comes out further. So what we should be able to hear is that rotary, let me see, the modulation rate, if I set it to slow, depth to very deep, well, not very deep, so not very deep. Well, I mean, what we're trying to demonstrate here is that how hard we hit the keys has some effect on that frequency of rotation of those notional rotary horns. Now the other thing to point out here is that we have a scaling slider here. So the particular amount by which that envelope follower impacts the modulation rate, and therefore the rotary horn spinning speed, depends on a scale factor that we can adjust by tweaking this slider here. So down there it should have hardly any impact. If we dial it to maximum, we should get the maximum impact. Well, I think that's speeding up as we hit harder. Yeah, definitely. Now whether that's an aesthetically pleasing effect or not, that's a matter of debate, but that's what the envelope follower does. So the last wedge to look at is this one labelled sequence. Now this one is similar but adds another layer of complexity. Again, what it does is, according to something that we're going to call a sequence, one or other of the module parameters underneath the hood will vary dynamically. We're going to choose a thing called preset called choir. I happen to know that this is a one we can use to demonstrate. If you look at that in the help, it says the sequencer increases the echo level. What does that sound like? So the echo level is pretty low by default. If we bump it up, we'll make the echo a little bit longer and the feedback longer. Okay, so we're going to go into the sequence that drives this particular dynamic variation, and we do that by pressing this sequencer label at the top center of the screen. Now don't forget we've got two independent algorithms loaded, so we have to choose at the top right here whether we're working on A or B. So we were on A, we'll leave it on there. The sequence is running. Now the sequence, if I just come back out of there, the sequence is running because I have the host transport running, which is AUM. If you look at the top left here, I've clicked the play button. That's necessary for one of the file players to play. If the transport is stopped, the file playback doesn't happen. So that's the reason I have it running in this instance. If we go back to classic FX, you'll see that the sequencer is no longer running, that cursor is not moving. When it runs, if we look at the bottom right here, that start button has a flash over it, and indeed that's a way to start it manually. We go back, we're just going to re-enable that host transport. So we'll go into the sequencer. What are we looking at here? So if you look at the bottom of the screen, once again we've got something that looks like the step sequencer within Synthscaper. I'm not going to go into this in enormous detail, first of all because I'll get confused about my own understanding of this. But we've got, you know, fairly conventional setup where we've got 16 steps, we've got a BPM, which you can't see on this screen actually. BPM is set at the top left on the main screen. At the moment it's inter-app audio 120 BPM. We've got some numbers at the bottom which allow us to divide the speed of that sequence. You can see it slowed down when I went from 1.0 to 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 is the slowest. And also there's some fractional parts to that. Now you might think when you first tinker with this that there's a bug because clicking the fractional part doesn't turn off the whole part, but actually I think this allows you to set 1.5, 1.25, 3.75 as the multiplier or divider. Again, you're able to get strange rhythms basically. Let's set this to 4 steps. Now what we're looking at, the large rectangular area in the middle of the screen is a zoomed in portion of the bird's eye view of the sequence above. If we've got 16 steps, if I move that window at the top across, it changes what's displayed in the larger portion in the middle. Now all the sequence is set to nothing at the minute, but if I just demonstrate by tweaking something, then slide that across, you can see that it's just panning that little window. So this is just a graph that allows us at each step of the sequence to vary the value of the particular parameter that's being controlled. So in this case the parameter is the echo level, which is 0 when the node is at the bottom. Now is it 0 or is it whatever it was probably the starting value and it varies by 0, I think, not sure about that. And then we can put it to maximum if we drag the node all the way to the top. Now actually there's a little bit of a rough edge here. You can see that those numbers disappear off the top if we drag the node to maximum, so I'll leave it just shy of maximum, and we can put that off the beat as well if we want to get a, you know, again it just changes the complexity of the rhythm. By default that value ramps up in a linear fashion and down in a linear fashion. If I change where it's got the word lin, if I click on that it becomes logarithmic or exponential, and then the fall off can also be logarithmic or exponential. Change that node. You know, you can get some fairly complicated stuff here. We're working on four steps there. You'll notice there with the 4-step sequence I'm dragging the left node up and down. It's moving that line at the right as well. Now that's because it wraps around. Halfway through the sequence it's going to affect the echo level. We'll make it linear both ways, and we'll make that sequence slow. I think that should be audible. So if we close that, you should see now, if you look at this wedge at the top center of that dial, we can see that pulsation that reflects the variation of that that echo level parameter. We won't hear it until we adjust this scaling slider like we did on the envelope follower. So if we put it to maximum, what do we hear? Well, we're not hearing any echo. That's because I'm hitting the key at a particular part of the sequence. If I time my keystroke with the ramping up of that parameter by the sequence, we should hear a different effect. Make the echo rate shorter. So you should hear that effect is varying depending on where in that sequence we've got to. Now again, that's just a very simple and not very interesting demonstration, but hopefully you'll see that there's great potential in there. If I choose a preset, the presets that have got hard-coded sequences already built in are the ones with rhythmic in brackets. So if I choose a one, so we can see the sequencer is active, it's doing something. There's probably some exponential ramp up in there, because there you can see that isn't a linear pulsation. If you know what I mean. Okay, so it is exponential, not logarithmic, but so that's not a very complex. Some of these have got very complex rhythms, sequences built in. That one, yeah, I mean that one's just wacky. I don't know what that's going to sound like. Radioactive, what does that sequencer control? Sequencer controls the low pass and comb filters. You'll have to read that for yourself. I mean, it's just something where, okay, use this as a case in point. It says the sequencer controls, in this preset, the low pass and comb filters. I mean, I don't know what a comb filter is. The sequence points define a mix of comb filter with clear signal. The sequencer control changes the low pass filter frequency. Now if you try and make sense of that and predict what it's going to sound like, you're going to get tied up in knots right away, and I have no intuition that's going to tell me what that sounds like. That really is something that relates to the philosophy of how to use this thing. Don't get too tied up with the specifics of the technicalities of what's going to control what. Suck it and see. You plug it in, you choose a preset that's going to sound fairly coherent, and you work from there outwards by tweaking various things until you get some pleasing sounds.
My daddy was an aviator. He really loved his aeroplane. He did not need a simulator. The restless sky was his domain. In every shade of cloud and weather, he painted his trails across the sky. The center grain and oil and leather. Oh, how my daddy loved to fly. My daddy was an aviator.
So there it is, classic effects from Igor Vasiliev. A very nice, nuanced and quite deep and somewhat scary effects package. Kind of an alternative to something like Black Hole Reverb. Very different in the detail, but a similar kind of expansion of your soundscape. Beautiful user interface. There's a real kind of steampunk atmosphere to this application. On the one hand, it's got a kind of Star Trek user interface, and on the other hand, it's steam age audio effects. Some of them practical, mechanical, electromechanical effects almost. If there was a piece of hardware, it'd be delivered in a walnut box with Bakelite knobs and probably brass fittings on. But there it is, very interesting to play with, and a worthy addition to the Igor-scape.